Thank you, Lee, for having me tonight on PHP Hands, and thank you everybody for attending. I hope that you find this talk interesting. Tonight, I'm gonna talk about high write tests, and more than me trying to convince you on what you should be doing, I would like to raise the topic of what practice you may like of what we are going to present, and if there is something that you don't like, actually, that you start to think a little bit more about it. So before we get into it, I would like to introduce myself. My name is José. I'm a software engineer from Spain. I've been living here in UK for about 8 years, and my PHP experience is since university, so almost 12 years, but professionally only for the last 10 years. Like I said, today I'm gonna talk about what I have found over the last several years, or what are the best practices, or how I like to write tests to make them on a way that they are easier to follow, easier to maintain. And also I will cover some of the topics that hopefully some of the features that you already know from PHPUnit, but I found sometimes we are talking with some less senior engineers that there are some things that they are not aware of. So hopefully you are aware of all of them. If not, maybe you will discover some interesting things. First and foremost, like I say, is like this talk is not about how do you write good unit tests. It's like there is plenty of literature all over the internet about how to do good testing. This is more about the code that you have supporting those unit tests, like data providers, things that will help you to debug your tests easier, things that can help you to make sure that you are testing everything. So we will cover many different areas. And like I said, all the practices that they are here are highly opinionated, is what I think, what is best, based on my experience. Like I said, take whatever you think that is worthy. And if there is something that you don't like, have a thought. Maybe you will find a better way to doing it. I will be quite happy to hear about it in the future, because obviously there is room for improvement. If we move to the first topic that I would like to cover, we will go over some of the small details of PHPUnit and also the new feature that PHP 7 has brought us. And to make this easier to digest, let's go over this example. So we have here a very easy math class that is having several methods like add values, multiply values, divide, power. So at least we have now a representation of what we are going to be testing over the next few examples. And what I found as best practice, one of the first things I would like to say is like, actually testing code is an application code, and we don't need to follow the same rules. It's like we have best practices for writing PHP, for writing code. We have PSR 0, 1, 2, and 4, if I am not mistaken, establishing the standards. You always need to name your variables with something that makes sense, but when you have unit tests, when you're writing unit tests, actually you have two different cases. You have the cases that you are writing an API for your unit test, so you add extra functionality that, yes, over there you should use the same rules. But when you are writing tests itself, it's like you are not writing an API. You are writing kind of a list of tests that they are going to be executed by PHPUnit on an imperative way, even though they are right on a class. So I don't think that we should follow the same rules. And let's go with some examples. First and foremost, every time that we have a test case, we are testing a specific class. That specific class, in this case, is math. It's like, if you were writing application code, you will call that variable probably math, but actually our test class is already telling us what we are testing. We are testing a math class, so we don't need to name the variable the same. Actually, we can use something else that is subject under test. So whenever we are using this class or copy part of the code, I tend to be lazy. And whenever I start in a new test class, I copy part of the code. Now I don't need to rename the variable. And also I know what we are testing, because subject under test is quite descriptive, even though we are using just the initial for that. So if we ever want to know what we are testing, it's like I say, you already know in which file you are. So you have the answer over there. Another example is, I believe PSR4 enforces the the methods to be camel case. That makes a lot of sense when you are writing objects. You need to think that when you are writing objects, they are kind of like a public API. Everything that interacts with them is like it's going to be calling those methods. You want those methods to be as small as possible, that they do specific things, that they don't grow. It's like that they do simple things. So you want them to be short, but whenever we are testing, in reality, you are not calling those methods at all. It's like I said, PHPUnit is calling those methods to execute the test. And if I look at this, actually, it's really hard to read what it says. It's too many words put together. On the other hand, if we use underscore with a snake case, it's easier to read what it means because it's a long sentence. Like I say, we are not calling this method. Why does it matter? The only drawback of this approach actually is like now you will have two standards, one for your application code and one for your unit test. So it's something that I like. It's something that I am not using at the moment, at least not in my company, but I think it's more valuable be able to read the test so you know what's going on. Another thing that PHP brought us with that is actually return times. Hopefully, most of you by now will be on PHP 7 or thinking about migrating anytime soon. So even though most of the tests are not going to return anything, it's nice if you can assert that the return type is there, because at the same time, you should be using something like PHP stand or PSOund to make sure that your code is as good as possible. So having that certainty of static typing that PHP stand brings us as code analyzer is really good, because actually you may have some cases that is not just void. For example, one of the features that PHPUnit has is actually depends. As you can see over in the notation, you can make some of your tests depend on other tests, and the return of the test that you are depending on, it will be passed to the second test. So you can use that. You don't need to, for example, in here, you don't need to construct the object again and again and again. Dependencies between tests, it can be tricky, it can speed up things. So think about when you want to use them. Another thing that PHP 7 brought us is actually argument types. As you can see here, now we want to test the multiply method, and we pass two arguments and the result. The problem, as you saw earlier, I don't know if you remember, actually, multiply is not enforcing the parameter a to be an integer. If you are on PHP 5 and you want to migrate to PHP 7, for example, you can put that if it's not an integer, you throw the type error, that is a PHP 7 exception. So if we now assert those types, we actually cannot test that if I pass something to multiply that is not an int, it's throwing that exception. While that may seem a little bit bad, actually is, in my opinion, is much better, because now you are kind of forced to have two different cases. You can have on one side your positive cases that you test all the different valid inputs and making sure that you get the correct results out. And in another place, you can test any type of exceptions, error when something doesn't go wrong. Sorry, when something does go wrong. Because I've seen many times people actually passing exceptions into those arguments in here and say, if there is an exception, tell PHPUnit to expect that exception. And if not, you actually test the result, but we are adding logic to the test. Overall, I go against adding any type of logic to the test. Your test should be as simple as possible, as silly as possible. So they are easy to read, easy to understand, and they execute fast without any complications. If you need to think too much about your test, especially simple, I'm not talking about bigger classes, harder classes to test. It's like it should be very easy to read through them. It should be really easy to reason about them. And as you can see here, we have a test multiply that actually takes several inputs and assert an output. Hopefully, all of you by now, you should be aware of what are data providers. Data providers are a feature of PHPUnit that actually you can specify different cases And all those different cases, they will pass through your method. So as you can see here on line 15 and 22, we have different cases, and each one of those cases is an item on the bigger array. And that array, the different items get passed into the arguments of the method that we are testing. Another interesting feature I didn't discover until actually something like 2 years is that your test can actually take multiple providers. You are not constrained to just have one provider. You can put as many as you want. So if you are able to break down your test into multiple ones, this can be quite handy because they can be, for example, more reusable. So take advantage of this feature. And as you can see, it's like now here I have 2 providers that they are both named differently. And actually there's plenty of ways of naming the providers: data provider multiply, or the other way around, multiply data provider, multiply provider. Which one shall we use? In here, even though I've seen other people calling it valid data, invalid data, my preference actually is use data provider using that prefix. Why? Everything in your unit test that is a test, they are prefixed by test. So you know all the methods that they are prefixed by test are text that they are going to be executed. If we prefix everything that is a data provider as data provider, actually is very easy to find, because whenever you go to the notation and say, this text is taking a data provider, which one? I type data provider and I am offered all the ones that we have. Easy to find. How do we organize these data providers? In my experience, I have come into terms that I like to have the expected value as the first argument within the case for my data provider. This actually goes kind of the opposite, or in the same way that Yoda conditionals, which I am not quite fond of them, it's my preference. And it's like, why do I like to have the expected value first? Because actually when you are testing anything, you are testing a method that the most likely thing to happen to that method, if it changes, is that it's going to grow. So if it's growing, we are now appending new values to the end of that array. And we can still see at the beginning what is the expected value that we are getting out of the testing, whatever we are testing. And if we call it the expected value, the variable actually expected, is even better, because we are following kind of the standard that PHPUnit has. Whenever you are asserting something, you have 2 values. The first one is expected. The second one is actual, which kind of is already hinting us, whenever we are getting any output from our method, the method that we are testing, that we can call that variable actual and then pass it to the assertion. So it's quite clear for everybody that is reading it how these 2 values are going to be used. If you are not using actual, result is another common one that I've seen. But in this case, unless I'm going to inspect the object that comes out of that method that we are testing, I wouldn't change the name. If the multiply method will be returning an object, and I couldn't assert that object straight away, I will need to assert different parts, then in that case, I will use a variable name that is according to whatever the output object is coming out. Another reason to use expected first is whenever you are testing variadic functions. Now, our function takes multiple values, so our testing function takes multiple values. So if I have the expected at the end, that wouldn't work. So my preference is put it, like I said, expected at the beginning. But one of the things that you have seen now is like whenever we have data providers, the different values that they come from the data providers, they go into the method as arguments. But we saw earlier another example of a feature that did the same. That actually is the depends. You can have a method that has a data provider and also depends on another method. Which one goes first? This was an interesting question because I never did this until a few months ago. And actually, if you have a depends, that always goes last. So this is how the signature now looks like when we have a data provider and a depends. And this works here very nice. But what happens when we add variadic to the formula? Now it doesn't work. Now we need to change things a little bit, and we need to pass now an array, and we need to deconstruct that array. This is something that I don't like, and I wish that it could be changed to have the depends at the beginning, but I don't know how easy it will be that to change, if worth it, but it's something to consider whenever you are using data provided and depends. The depends always go last. Another feature that you have with data providers, and actually not many people is aware of, or less I was expecting, is you can name the different cases that are coming from your data provider. As you can see here, we have two different cases. The first one that is multiplying two positive values, and the second one that is multiplying two different negative values, or two negative values. Why do we want to name the different cases? Why is this relevant? Because actually, PHPUnit is quite clever, and it will tell you if your data provider has an associative array. It will display what is the name that you gave to that specific case. If you don't provide the case, this will display as dataset pound and the number, which the number refers to the numeric index. But actually, if you can name your different cases in here is quite useful, because whenever somebody comes after you, they will know what you are trying to test over there, especially if it's not obvious. Maybe in this case, it's a little bit too obvious, but take all of these examples I put here in this presentation with a little bit pinch of salt. It's just put it together so it was easier to present. And where do we place the data providers? Personally speaking, if I have a test that is requiring a data provider, I will put the data provider immediately after. If it's used by one, at most two methods. If more than two methods use it, I will put the data provider at the end of the class. Also, like I explained earlier, your testing methods can take multiple data providers. So actually, if you are migrating, for example, from PHP 5 to 7, like I said, you could have a trade of data providers, so you can reuse all of these to make sure that whenever you are passing the wrong thing to your class, it's throwing an exception, or you can have a collection of these that you make sure that you always remember to test the edge cases. For example, as you can see here, PHP in max and PHP in minimum. So if you have a data provider that is always there, it's easier to remember that you need to test those things if you are able to pass this somehow around. And another thing that some people tend to forget, I tend to forget a lot as well, is your data providers actually, they don't need to return an array. They need to return something iterable. And what is something iterable? Actually generators. If your use cases are quite simple, that's fine. You can use an array, you hard code everything, and you're ready to go. But in this example, we are trying to make sure that our serialized class actually is serializing one of our objects or value objects into a correct JSON. So instead of writing down everything, the different currency, the different amount, I can actually use or create an object. I break down that object, getting the different values, and I yield each one of the cases. So I can reuse that variable if needed. I can create more complex cases that if I put all of that into an array, actually will be really hard to do. So this way, you will write probably more code, but overall it will be cleaner. So it's worth it to keep this in mind, that generators can be actually quite useful. Moving on, another thing that whenever we need to test, especially services, is mocking. We need to mock our dependencies. We are testing a class. Actually, we just want to focus on what that class is doing. We don't want to focus on what the classes that class depends on are doing. So we just mock to make sure that we control all the inputs so we can assert that output. So let's put another example again. We have this dummy service that takes two condition interfaces. The condition interfaces are quite simple. They just have one method that is result that returns a Boolean, true or false. And whenever we execute this dummy, If the first condition is true, we return 1. If the second condition is true, we return 2 and 0 in any other case. So one of the things that happen a lot in tests, actually you are constructing your classes multiple times, maybe not that many when you're in your application code, but in here in tests, probably you will have many constructors all over the place of your class. I think one of the best things that you need to do is put that on a multi-line. The chances that service, especially if it's a service, is going to receive more dependencies in the future, it will make it cleaner to add them, it will make cleaner to review it. Because if it start to grow down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments and you keep one in one line, it just gets messy. So as soon as you have it from the beginning in multi-line, I think it's much better. And if you notice here, now we are starting to kind of repeat ourselves, create mock condition, create mock condition. We are testing one thing and we are creating 2 mocks and we are passing the class around and we are just testing the constructor. We are not even testing the different cases. If we create the different tests for the different cases, we are going to repeat this create mock a lot. So actually, why you will even bother to create mock and create mock and create mock? Another thing that I found it that is quite interesting is for dependencies that you use in your tests, actually create a private function that you use within that class that is already asserting what is giving you back. That is easier to change because if now I need to change whatever is the class that I am passing around, whatever is the interface of that class, it's like I go here and I change it in one place and it will update all my code. I could change as well the create mock in multiple places, but I find this way to be actually way cleaner because also give us a second advantage. As you can see, our condition class is quite dummy. It only has one thing, a result method that is giving us something back. We can actually do something clever about it. And it's like, rather than repeat myself again and again and again and again, I can say, okay, I create a condition with an argument. And if I pass the argument, it means that the result method is going to be called. And this is what you are giving me back. This, like everything in life, is very powerful. It can be quite tricky. I only like doing this when the classes are very small, when there is only one method at most that is going to be always used, or one method that is, there are few methods on that class, but that method is very repeated in all your mocking for testing this. So having one argument is good, 2 arguments started to smell a little bit. I wouldn't go further than this, but I found that putting part of this functionality on those private methods actually makes things way faster. If there is any changes, again, we only need to go to one place to change it. If we need to do any refactoring, because for example, now we rename that interface and it's not result anymore, it's something else. The more effort that you need to put on updating your test is the harder will be the refactoring. So I think this actually helps to make changes faster, and overall it should help you iterate over your application. Another thing that I have seen, why is this blinking? Sorry about that. Another thing that I've seen around in my company, some of my colleagues do it, is actually they create a stateful test. You set up in the setup method of your test class, you create your different dependencies, and also you create the class already, the subject under test with those dependencies. And then whenever you are testing things, you are just changing that dependency and making sure that is going to return the correct thing. So it creates neater tests, smaller, easy to read. Personally speaking, I find it a little bit harder to reason about because I need to have a look on the setup. Sometimes the setup does multiple things, not just one. In the other fashion that I do things, every time that you pass a dependency, you create a new thing. And if you are creating a new thing and you pass an argument, you know that it's doing something different. But in here, you may need to come back again to the setup to see if something is done. and maybe somebody changed in the setup something and it's affecting all the tests. So I'm not very fond, honestly, of doing this stateful test. I'm not saying that it's bad at all. It's just, like I said, this is my opinion. Oh, give me a second because this has got stuck in here. And also, if you want to make them a little bit less dependent in the constructor, you can put a test constructor and now make your test to depend directly or indirectly on that test constructor. So one thing to bear in mind, this will only work if actually you are passing references around. If you, instead of references, you are passing objects, scalars or immutable stuff, now all of this is not going to work. So again, I prefer the other way of doing things that is more stateless. Another thing that actually is quite interesting if you go with this approach of creating private method for mocks is actually now you can make a mock factory that can be reused. Think about whenever you are testing middlewares or request handlers. It's like again and again you are going to require some dependencies like passing a server request, like passing a request handler around. So what's the point of creating those classes or those mocks again and again and again? It's like, see, there is little value. Also, some people tend to do the mistake of creating a mock for the server request. Server request is actually an immutable object, so you cannot mock it, or at least not in an easy fashion. It gets extremely hard. So just pass a class around that is the server request straight away. If you provide this, now people cannot misuse it. They cannot think, oh, I need to mock server requests. It's like, no, you cannot mock server requests. So having this mock factory, I can be quite useful. But if you go that way, create very small ones that they are focused on very specific problems. Make sure that they don't grow very big because now you are starting to have a little bit of code smell. So keep them very focused. And also you notice that there are different ways of calling this method. They are giving you dependencies that you require. You can call it create handler. You can call it create handler mock. Overall, my preference is avoid any mock naming, create, and whatever dependency we are creating. I don't like it to call it mock because sometimes they are mock, other times they are not. And within mocking, you have different types. You have stubs, you have spies. So if I avoid any names, it's like we just go to the point as we are creating a dependency. And actually, as you can see in this test, you are not always creating mocks. Actually, sometimes it's even simpler to make a small concretion of the interface so you can test what you are after. So if you don't care about the response at all in here, you can do just this. Easy peasy, done. Maybe this is not the best example, but if, for example, you are doing some tests that you need to store things on a database, you can actually create an anonymous class for a repository. So it helps you enough to do that job of that test that you are doing, and you don't need to care about persisting things, anything like that. It will make your test way, way faster. Another very interesting area of PHPUnit, or what testing is giving us, is actually the ability to make sure that we have covered most of our code, that most of our code is tested, that the system that we are building is robust, reliable, that if we are doing any changes, we can know it. And one of the best tools for knowing what we are testing is actually the coverage directive. When we are running unit tests, there are several tools that actually can inspect what are the lines of code that they are being run. Xdebug is one of them. Pickoff is another one that is picking up again. By having code coverage, we can make sure that we are testing everything that we need to test. But obviously, when you are testing different stuff, you need to create mocks like we saw earlier, or maybe you need to use that server request that is an actual object. So you don't want the other execution of files to pollute what you are testing. We are here testing just dummy, so I want my coverage when I run this test to just focus on dummy, and the way to do that is by using the covers annotation. That way, PHPUnit will only take into account the lines of code that they have run for that dummy class. It won't take into account any of the supporting code if we are not mocking, for example. Why coverage is very important? It's not to display that we have 100% code coverage. That will be ideal, but sometimes is quite unrealistic, especially the bigger arrow system, the more complex they become, they tend to be impossible to have 100% code coverage. So you should aim for a high value, but the actual value of it is making sure that you are testing all the branches. In more than one occasion, I write all my unit tests. It's like, okay, I'm testing everything. I go to the code coverage and I discover, actually I forgot that, and that. So if you are using code coverage telling you what you have actually tested, you can go there and say, okay, I need to cover those cases I just forgotten. And if you remember earlier, on the last line of our dummy class, we have a ternary operation. We have three different values that they are coming out, 1, 2, and 0. So I'm testing here everything. How much do you think that the code coverage is? Well, I'm not testing everything, I'm missing 0. How much do you think that is the code coverage of this? Actually, it's 100%. I was quite fond of ternary operations because for me they look quite neat. It makes code look smaller, easier to read, but actually this is the root of evil. It's like my coverage is telling me that everything is being tested when in reality it's not. So I will disencourage ternary operator as much as possible. It's like if my code coverage is misleading me, I think it's worth it just write the code in a way that I can test it, I can trust it, I can make sure that it's doing what it's doing it. And I can have an assertion that I'm testing everything that I want to test. In order to make sure that you are covering or having code coverage, you can use XML configuration of PHPUnit. There are multiple ways of configuring PHPUnit. Lately, what I'm seeing most is actually people are using the script section of Composer to define all the different outputs that you have for your unit tests or your integration tests. But actually, I don't like to have that information over there. I don't like to use the arguments of the command. I rather prefer have all that configuration outside of Composer, because if I want to change anything, I don't want to see a change in Composer. I prefer having Composer just focus on the dependencies and put things outside. So have a look on the PHPUnit configuration. You have very useful stuff, like we can see here. We can force that all the classes have those cover annotation, and those cover annotation are strictly focused on specific things. And also one thing that is quite interesting, if you know the pyramid of tests, there are different test levels that you can use. You can do unit tests, system tests, integration tests. So if we output the HTML for the different test suite that we have, actually it's going to get a bit messy because there are some things I may not be able to test in my unit test, but I am able to test in the integration test. So I will have two sets of HTML displaying me what it have been tested. But actually there is already a tool that can help us for doing that. We can tell PHPUnit to export all this testing on a specific type of file that is .conf, that is like plain PHP. And we can use the dependency PHP-conf to actually merge all these different outputs and give us a unique set of Clover XML if you want to pass it to your build plans to make sure that your coverage is always below above a threshold, or you can produce your HTML with a concatenation of all the different tests. So that can give you a more realistic view of everything that you are testing. On the logging topic, something that that is sometimes overlooked is actually the text dot. I don't know how many people have seen it. Is by default, PHPUnit gives you a list of all the tests that is being executed as a dot when everything goes well. If everything goes bad, you get an F, you got a warning, you got an S for a skip. But actually, there is a different output that is called text dot that in a list of stuff, PHPUnit is going to present you with all the tests that they have been executed. And if they were correct, this actually can be really useful because even product owners and product managers can read this. So whenever you have your build plans, you can put this together along with them saying, this is my artifact, this is everything that has been tested. So if something goes wrong, you can say, okay, we have a test for that. It was proof it's working as expected. Maybe it was wrong requirements, because this doesn't need to be only for unit tests. Actually, it can be for behavioral tests. And all of that fancy stuff is given to you by PHPUnit for free. PHPUnit will automatically convert your names of the methods into sentences. So it will remove the text prefix. And if it's camel case or snake case, it will replace the breaks in your words and make it a nice sentence. If the sentence that you name your method is not good enough, actually you can use the text dot notation that you can tell PHPUnit what to display for that specific text, while at the same time using the different substitution. As you can see here, we have A, B, and expected, and they are printed in a very nice fashion. So you can see whenever something goes wrong, because it's when we care, you can see what you are actually executing and see if actually you mistype any of the values of what you need to go and fix. Very interesting topic as well that tends to be a little bit overlooked is actually domain-specific assertions. And I think the best example to talk about this is actually request handler. In here, we have a small class, request handler, that it takes an account that is being set by a previous middleware, and it creates a response, and using a render an output, and it gives it back. So imagine now that we are doing end-to-end tests, we are doing some integration tests, and we are testing that our API is returning the correct value. So usually people will go in here and say, assert the same, 200, matches the status code, that the headers line matches, and the actual content matches what we are expecting. But now if this fail, it's like, okay, 200 doesn't match 400. It's an integration test. I don't want to know that 200 is not 400. I want to know what it went wrong. One of the ways of doing it, actually, on that line 11, we could tell, okay, if one of these goes wrong, I output a specific message, or maybe I output the response body, get contents. What I don't like of actually having messages on this assertion is like, then you need to maintain them. Many times they are not providing a lot of value. If you see that message and you are already seeing what is not matching, you can go very easily to the code and say, okay, this is not working, and you just go and fix it. So the value that those messages added, so I don't think it's worth it. So I don't use message, or very rarely. So we have here these assertions that they are not providing as much information as we want. So how you can make sure that they provide more useful information? Basically just resave them. Now you put that content is the first thing that you check. If the content matches, then I make sure that everything along the way is fine. But so far we are not talking about domain-specific assertion. No, because we haven't put this together into its own place. Now, whenever we are testing any response, actually, we have one place that we are asserting a specific type response. In this case, an HTTP response. So there is no need to have those three assertions again and again on your different methods that you are testing. You can put all that together into an assertion and use it in many places. You could potentially even put this on a trait and use it on different places. PHPUnit also gives you the ability to add your own assert classes. I find them that they are a little bit harder to do that going this way, but If you think that is better for your case or they are more complex cases or more useful, go that way. If your case are quite simple, just having a private or public function within your classes to assert things and only one place to maintain them. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning, and it's something that happened in my company. How many dependencies you think this handler method has? You will say 2, 3, maybe more. One of the things that why we write testing is because we can assert what are the different inputs and what are the different outputs of our classes. We can assert the signature. If there are changes in our dependencies, now our tests are likely to fail because if we are mocking stuff now, we are mocking the different stuff, things like that. In here, we have actually, in reality, 1, 2, 3, and 4 dependencies. While you think that you can unit test this, in reality, you cannot test it. That get attribute, I have a misspell there, that get attribute actually is like using a service locator. If now I change the middleware that is setting that attribute, my test is going to continue passing because my test is setting that attribute. Sorry, no, line 6 is correct. My test is setting that attribute because it's what we are expecting, but there is no way that I assert that there has been a change in the system. So I cannot unit test that. Now I need to use an integration test and test the whole path to make sure that it works. So if you are using PSR with getting attributes, be really, really careful because without realizing things like this, it could happen. Like I say, a change may blow up things in your system and you won't notice until actually a user has reported, or hopefully if you have monitoring, you will pick that even a user notices. And we are coming to the end of the talk. Actually, some bonus tips, not big things, but I think it's worth mentioning. Whenever we are testing stuff, sometimes it's quite hard to come up with clever names or trying to don't repeat the stuff. So we already have in PHP something that gives us pseudo randomness. So in here we have an account that has a name. If we want to change the name, we call it again name. We put the line we are on. We set that name, and then we assert that the name has changed. And it's very easy to make sure that it has changed because there is very unlikely that there is going to be a name with that lane. And if you make any change here, it doesn't matter because as the lane changes, your test will still pass. If you are thinking why I'm not using random bits or empty random, it's like randomness actually is constrained by your system. The seed is coming from the system, the different random values. So going there, actually, if you are running tests a lot or you have too many tests, actually it could run out of randomness. So we don't need randomness for tests, at least for this type of test. We only need something that give us that warranty to make sure that it's like, if something changes or something is wrong, we can easily spot it. And the last one, and I think this has been one of the greatest discoveries I had in the last year. Actually, one of my colleagues, Clark, that is in the other room, actually he started to write Gherkin within the unit test. Maybe in this test doesn't make sense because it's quite dummy and it's quite small. But whenever we are writing big services that they start to integrate things to do more complex things, like when you are mocking all the different dependencies, all the different stuff, all the different conditions, the state of your service, actually, it's very easy to get it wrong at a time. So we already have Gherkin in behavioral tests, even though it's used on a completely different fashion to what is used here. But having those comments saying, if this condition happen, if this is set, if this goes through here, when we execute our dummy service, we can see that the result is 1. Actually, can help a lot. Like I say, if the test case is very small, there is no any usefulness, and actually having comments that you need to maintain is hard. But if it's something more complex, you can assert that you are doing things right, and also other people can read it. It's like if you have QA engineers that they are not tested, actually it's easier for them to come here and follow what you are writing. They can assert that what you are doing in the code is right, and they can have the warranties that it's like, okay, this is according to the specification. The user story is following in the acceptance criteria because I can read and see what it's doing it if they are not experts in the language, or like I said, they are not testers. And this is all I have for you this night. I hope that you find some of those things useful. If not, I hope that that has brought some question for you to think what I can take from DR. Maybe I should change things, or maybe I should do things differently. Any questions, any comments?
I'm wondering if